Mississippi. Late afternoon, October 4th, 1991. A calloused hand, stained with decades of oil and grit, slides a card into the punch clock. Clack. The final timestamp echoes through the hall, cold, hollow, and definitive. The worker takes one last look at the cavernous corridor before reaching for the master switch. With a heavy metallic thud, the fluorescent lights flicker and die. In the sudden gloom, the massive steel presses stand like silent ghosts. The rhythmic roar of engines, the very heartbeat of America for nearly a century, has vanished, replaced only by the lonely whistle of the wind through rusted window frames. This isn't just a factory closing. This is the funeral of an empire. There was a time when 1 out of every 4 bicycles rolling across the American landscape bore that legendary cross-shaped logo. They didn't just sell steel and rubber. They sold the dream of freedom to every child in the nation. Yet, in the blink of an eye, the dynasty turned to ash. How did a titan that weathered the Great Depression and 2 world wars end up dead in a derelict building amidst the cotton fields of Mississippi? Step inside, where the dust-covered bikes are waiting to tell the story of a fallen legend. To understand why it ended in the shadows of Mississippi, we must go back to where the fire was first lit, in the frozen soil of Germany more than a century ago. Chapter 1. The Immigrant Engineer. Hardheim, Germany, 1871. The ground was frozen hard enough to ring when the casket hit the bottom of the grave. Ignaz Schwinn, just 11 years old, stood over his father's funeral, watching the final act of loss. His widowed mother, faced with impossible economics, could not afford to keep him. Within weeks, the boy was shipped off, an act of necessity, to a mechanical trade school, a brutally practical institution designed to teach poor children how to work with their hands so they might never starve. While other boys his age were still chasing games and scraps of fun, Ignaz was relentlessly drilled in the unforgiving discipline of lathes, precision gears, and industrial metalwork. It was a brutal, lonely existence, but it was the education that saved and shaped his life. By the time he was 16, he had graduated to an apprenticeship with a traveling bicycle repair shop, traversing the small provincial towns of Germany with nothing but a well-worn toolbox and a rolled-up bedroll. Those years on the road were more than a struggle for survival. They were a vast field study. In every town, Ignaz saw the failures of current designs, and in his mind, he was already re-engineering the world. Bicycles were not just a passing fad, they were an explosion across Europe, the newest, most sophisticated technology, representing the tangible future of personal transportation. Ignaz became obsessed. He didn't merely repair them, he absorbed them. He disassembled drivetrains and frames, sketching meticulously detailed improvements in notebooks he carried everywhere. He was not just learning a trade, he was studying how to construct an industrial empire. At 20 years old, Ignaz secured a pivotal position at Heinrich Kleier's bicycle factory in Frankfurt, then considered one of the most advanced manufacturing operations in all of Germany. Ignaz refused to be just another worker on the floor. He watched the flow of material, he learned the managerial logistics, and he pushed relentlessly for efficiency. Within a few short years, his talent was undeniable, earning him promotions to designer, then chief factory manager. By 1889, Kleier trusted the young man enough to task him with helping to design and oversee the construction of an entirely new facility, the famous Adler Works, which would swiftly become one of Europe's largest and most sophisticated industrial plants. Ignaz Schwinn was 29 years old, and he had already helped construct one of the most complex manufacturing facilities on the entire continent. Logically, he should have been satisfied. He was not. Because Ignaz perceived an economic reality that his comfortable German colleagues completely missed. Germany was crowded. The nascent bicycle market was already fiercely saturated, with every minor town boasting manufacturers viciously fighting over the same static pool of customers. There was simply no room left to grow. But across the vast Atlantic, America beckoned, a continent wide open, defined by industry, ambition, and barely contained chaos. It was a horizon that had no ceiling. In 1891, at the age of 31, Ignaz made a life-altering decision. It was a monumental gamble. He wasn't just chasing a dream, He was walking away from the very prestige and security he had spent his entire youth building. He booked passage on a steamship, crossing the churning ocean with nearly nothing but his tool-sharpened expertise. Soon, he stepped off the boat in Chicago, a city expanding vertically and horizontally at a breathtaking pace. He possessed only broken English and zero connections. His sole currency was a decade of experience building bicycles at the absolute highest level, and an unshakable, driving belief that he was destined for something far greater than simply clocking in for someone else. Chicago in the 1890s was the industrial Wild West. Bicycle companies were springing up on every available corner, fueled by a nationwide, almost hysterical craze. Everyone wanted one. Everyone was buying. It was a full-scale gold rush, and Ignis had just arrived equipped with the finest pickaxe available. He landed his first American job at Fowler's Cycle Manufacturing Company as a floor supervisor. Decent pay, respectable position, but already it was insufficient. Within 12 months, he upgraded, jumping to the International Manufacturing Company as head of their design team. Better pay. More expansive responsibility. Still, it was not enough. Every night, Ignis would return to his cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling, calculating the true costs. He was making other men wealthy. His superior designs, his innovations, were translating into their profits. He was 33, easily one of the premier bicycle engineers in Chicago, perhaps in all of America, yet he remained an employee, still taking orders, still building someone else's dream instead of his own. The comfort of a steady paycheck had become a cage. He realized that as long as he signed the back of another man's check, he would never be the one to sign the front of history. That ends now. Ignis spent months meticulously scouting for the perfect partner, someone who had the deep pockets he lacked, but the wisdom to stay out of the workshop. Chapter 2. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1894. Ignis Schwinn walked into a meeting that would irrevocably change his path. Across the mahogany table sat Adolf Frederick William Arnold, a powerful, established German-American businessman. Arnold was a co-founder of the Arnold Brothers meatpacking empire and chairman of the Haymarket Produce Bank. Arnold possessed the deep, essential capital. Ignis possessed the unmatched, irreplaceable skill. Arnold saw the fever gripping America, bicycles everywhere, and recognized that the boom was only just beginning. He needed an operator, someone who actually understood how to precisely build these machines at scale. Ignis needed the capital to finally cease working for other people. The handshake was quick, decisive, and final. In 1895, Arnold, Schwinn and Company was officially christened in Chicago. The agreement was elegantly simple. Arnold would write the foundational checks. Ignis would run the entire operation. No meddling committees, no board interference. Ignis finally had the commodity he had chased since stepping off that steamship: control. Their first step was naming the product. They ran a dealer contest, and remarkably, 4 independent dealers submitted the same suggestion: World. It was perfect, bold, aspirational, and universal. World bicycles hit the market equipped with state-of-the-art machinery that Ignis had personally specified, utilizing every lesson he had mastered in Germany and refined in Chicago. The quality was immediately discernible. These were not cheap, slapped-together knockoffs from a basement workshop. These were precision machines, constructed by an engineer who intimately understood metallurgy, frame geometry, and stress points. The timing was impeccable. America was in a frenzy. In Chicago alone, over 300 competing manufacturers were frantically cranking out bikes as fast as humanly possible. It was absolute chaos, a savage feeding frenzy. Shops materialized on every corner. Investment money flooded the sector. Everyone, it seemed, believed they were about to strike it rich. Most of them were fatally wrong. Ignis knew, with cold certainty, that the industry was poised for a massive collapse. He understood a foundational principle of speculative manias. You don't survive a gold rush by merely digging for gold. You survive by selling the shovels. And critically, those shovels must never break. While competitors resorted to cutting every imaginable corner to pump out volume, Ignis obsessed over the minutiae: the quality of the braze welds, the frame geometry that delivered stability, components guaranteed not to fail after 6 months of use. His goal was not to win this year's sales race. His goal was to win the next 20 years. Sales climbed steadily, and the reputation solidified. By 1899, Arnold and Schwinn were successful enough to make a major strategic move. They acquired the March Davis Bicycle Company and constructed an entirely new, massive factory designed to be bigger, more efficient, and far more automated than anything they had operated before. Ignis was scaling up production and technological capability, while his competition was frantically scrambling merely to survive the mounting pressure. Then came the first great test. American Bicycle Company, a colossal conglomerate, approached them with an offer. This was a classic trust, a monopoly play, buying up every manufacturer they could find in a ruthless attempt to corner the entire American market through consolidation. They wanted Arnold, Schwinn and Company. The offer was significant: substantial cash up front, guaranteed contracts, and the promise of stability. Most companies accepted immediately, capitulating to the sheer size of the trust. Ignis said no. Arnold stood by him. It was a profoundly gutsy maneuver because rejecting ABC meant going head-to-head with a corporate giant that was actively swallowing the competition whole. But Ignis didn't trust the numbers. He had seen this centralized, desperate strategy before. The whole thing, he felt, smelled like a house of cards built on poor engineering and debt. He preferred to bet everything on his own craftsmanship and foresight. 3 years later, in 1903, the American Bicycle Company Trust collapsed into spectacular bankruptcy. Every manufacturer foolish enough to join them went down with the ship, assets liquidated, factories shuttered, and thousands left unemployed. Arnold and Schwinn, however, remained standing, fiercely independent and consistently profitable. Ignis had dodged an industry-wide bullet that had decimated his closest competitors. Yet, as the dust settled from the corporate wars, a new sound began to drown out the whir of bicycle chains, the rhythmic chugging of internal combustion engines. The ground beneath the entire market was shifting. This wasn't just a change in business, it was a revolution in motion. Between 1900 and 1905, national bicycle sales plummeted by 25% as the world turned its gaze toward the automobile and the motorcycle. The car was transitioning from a rich man's novelty to legitimate transportation, while motorcycles offered a speed and thrill that no pedal-driven machine could match. The speculative bubble hadn't just leaked, it had violently popped. The great bicycle boom was unequivocally over. By 1905, the gold rush was over, and the hangover was brutal. Chicago's famed bicycle district, once a hive of frantic ambition, had fallen into a deafening silence, a sprawling graveyard of shuttered factories and broken dreams. But amidst the darkness of those industrial ruins, Ignaz Schwinn was not panicking. He was observing. He had navigated economic collapse before in the frozen soil of Germany, and he knew a fundamental truth. In the wake of a catastrophe, the survivors don't just endure, they inherit. Ignaz hadn't crossed an ocean in 1891 to be merely one of 300 manufacturers. He came to be the solitary one left standing when everyone else surrendered. As he looked out over the darkened skyline of Chicago, he knew his true empire would not be built on a fleeting fad, but on a pivot that would redefine the very meaning of the Schwinn name. Chapter 3: Surviving the Bust, 1905. The bicycle apocalypse was complete. 5 years earlier, Chicago housed 300 manufacturers. Now there were 12. That was the count. 12 survivors amid 300 corpses. Ignis Schwinn was not only one of them, he was actively hunting. While his remaining competitors liquidated remaining assets and auctioned off their equipment, Ignis was buying. He acquired bankrupt factories at literal pennies on the dollar, ruthlessly stripping them for parts, seizing their most advanced machinery, their patents, and their proprietary tooling. This was not mere opportunism, this was grand industrial strategy. He was consolidating an entire industry's manufacturing capacity and intellectual property into his single operation. By the end of the decade, Schwinn had constructed one of the most technologically advanced mass production facilities in America. Then, in 1908, Ignis made his boldest move yet. He fully bought out Adolf Arnold, every single share. After 13 years of symbiotic partnership, Ignis was the sole owner. Perhaps Arnold saw the end of an era and wished to settle into a quiet life, but Ignis saw only the birth of a new one. He didn't just buy out a partner, he reclaimed his absolute destiny. No more shared decisions, no more compromise. It was his company, his vision, his unconstrained empire. And he was about to expand it in a direction that few could have anticipated. Bicycles were not dead, but the adult market was stagnant. The only segment still showing life was the children's market. But that alone was too limited for the ambition of Ignis Schwinn. He needed industrial diversification, and he found it in motorcycles. The internal logic was perfect. Motorcycles utilized strikingly similar manufacturing processes, similar metallurgy, and identical engineering principles. His existing workforce already possessed the necessary skills to build high-quality frames, wheels, and drivetrains. It was a natural, profitable extension. In 1912, Schwinn acquired the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company, a small but respected motorcycle builder. 5 years later, in 1917, he purchased Henderson Motorcycle, merging the two operations into the powerful Excelsior Henderson brand. The motorcycle division exploded. Excelsior Henderson bikes were known for being fast, exceptionally reliable, and beautifully engineered. All the principles Ignis had applied to bicycles were now dedicated to engines and speed. By the early 1920s, Excelsior Henderson had become the third largest motorcycle manufacturer in America, trailing only the giants Indian and Harley-Davidson. Ignis was successfully running two concurrent, money-printing empires. But the key insight, the part many observers missed, was that while the motorcycle business was flashy and exciting, the bicycle business remained his essential foundation. And by 1914, that foundation became utterly dominant. Schwinn was now the largest bicycle manufacturer in the world, controlling over 25% of the entire American market. 1 out of every 4 bikes sold in the United States carried his name. He hadn't just survived the bust, he had conquered it. The market had consolidated exactly as he had predicted, and Schwinn emerged supreme. The adult bicycle market was largely gone, usurped by the rising popularity of the automobile. But the children's market, that was his, monopolized through trust. Parents implicitly trusted the Schwinn name. They knew it signified quality, rugged durability, and safety. A Schwinn wasn't a cheap toy. It was an investment designed to last for years, passed down through younger siblings, capable of surviving the kind of sustained, inventive abuse only children can inflict. Ignis had built a brand that meant something enduring, and in early 20th century America, that was more valuable than gold. But an empire built by one man faces its greatest risk in the mirror of time. Ignis knew that for Schwinn to endure, it needed more than his old-world grit. It needed a bridge to the modern age. Just after World War I, a new, critical element entered the operation. Ignis's son, Frank W. Schwinn. Frank had grown up watching his father forge an empire from absolute scratch. He understood the business, respected the engineering craft, and shared his father's almost religious obsession with quality. This was not a spoiled executive taking a cushy role. Frank had been preparing for this transition his entire life. He understood the grease of the factory floor, the economics of the dealers, and the desires of the customers. Ignis, now in his late 50s, was still sharp, still driven, but increasingly focused on the future. Frank represented continuity, a second generation capable of carrying the exacting vision forward without destroying the industrial infrastructure built so painstakingly. Throughout the 1920s, Schwinn operated at peak efficiency. The bicycle division was stable and consistently profitable. The motorcycle division thrived. Ignis had successfully diversified, weathered the storm of economic collapse, and emerged as an industrial titan. He had progressed from a broke German immigrant in 1891 to one of the most powerful manufacturers in America by 1930. Everything he touched seemed to turn to success. Everything he built endured. Everything he predicted came true. He survived when 300 others failed. But survival is not immortality. And the next test, The one that would demand the ultimate display of his genius was about to arrive. It was called the Great Depression, and it would be worse than anything America had ever witnessed. Chapter 4. The Depression-Era Pivot. October 1929. The stock market imploded with a noise heard across the globe. Ignaz Schwinn watched his personal investment portfolio, decades of carefully accumulated wealth, evaporate almost overnight. He was not personally bankrupt, but he was badly wounded, and unlike the complacent majority of financiers and businessmen, he knew precisely what was coming next. This was no market correction. This was not a temporary downturn. This was the terrifying beginning of economic catastrophe. By the summer of 1931, unemployment was skyrocketing toward 25%. Banks were failing daily. Factories were closing in droves. People were no longer contemplating purchasing motorcycles. They were struggling to afford bread. Ignaz called a crisis meeting with the senior staff of his Excelsior Henderson motorcycle division. The room was packed with engineers, managers, and production staff. They had a healthy order backlog. They had demand. Ignaz walked in and delivered 5 words that instantly paralyzed the room. "Gentlemen, today we stop." Ignaz stood at the head of the table, the weight of 40 years of ambition pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't just closing a factory, he was burying a dream to save a legacy. He was shutting down the entire motorcycle operation. Immediately, completely. No phase-out, no gradual winding down. They were finished. His managers erupted in stunned disbelief. They were the 3rd biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the country. They had orders. Why close a profitable, thriving division? The decision to kill the Excelsior Henderson motorcycle division in 1931 wasn't just prophetic vision, it was a financial eviction. The stock market crash had decimated Ignaz's personal fortune. With no buyers for the motorcycle division and the luxury market vaporizing, he didn't just choose to stop. The economy forced his hand. He circled the wagons around the bicycle division not because it was glamorous, but because it was the only lifeboat left. By September 1931, Excelsior Henderson was permanently shut down. Every machine was silenced. Every worker either absorbed into the bike factory or let go. While the father performed the brutal surgery to keep the company alive, the son began to infuse the survivor with new, rebellious blood. Ignaz's son, Frank W. Schwinn, now 35 years old, took over the reins of the bicycle division with a hand-picked, dedicated team. And here is where the genius of the succession became apparent. Frank didn't merely continue making the same conservative models. He took everything they had learned building powerful motorcycles, the styling, the chrome accents, the aggressive attitude, and brilliantly applied it to bicycles. In 1933, Schwinn introduced the B10E motorbike. It was a bicycle designed specifically to look like a motorcycle, styled for kids and teenagers who craved speed and rebellion. It featured aggressive, geometric lines, a faux tank-style frame, and the illusion of raw power. But there was a problem. The ride was too jarring. The narrow, high-pressure tires that worked on smooth pavement rattled a rider's teeth loose on Chicago's rough, uneven side streets. Frank approached the American Rubber Company with a specific, radical request. "Build me a balloon tire. Not the standard 28 by 1.5 inch skinny racing tire everyone uses. I want a soft, wide, cushioned 26 by 2.125 inches tire." American Rubber thought he was delusional. Frank convinced them regardless. The result changed the industry forever. The wider tires smoothed out the ride, absorbing bumps and road shock, making the bike comfortable for hours of use. Kids adored it. Parents loved it because their children actually wanted to ride it. In 1934, Frank refined the concept into the Aerocycle. It featured a leather saddle, gleaming chrome fenders, a plated headlight, and a real, functional horn. This machine looked like a miniature, polished motorcycle. It was gorgeous, an instant cultural icon. It swiftly became the defining image of the American paperboy bike, the essential cruiser that defined childhood mobility for a generation. Every competitor scrambled desperately to copy the design. But Schwinn was not relying on style alone. Frank established a dedicated quality control division, a concept almost unheard of in the contemporary bicycle industry. He was obsessive about consistency. Every weld was visually inspected. Every frame was physically tested. If it did not meet the exact standards, it did not leave the factory. To make that guarantee visible to the customer, Schwinn launched the Schwinn Quality Seal, the industry's first visible quality certification, a promise stamped right onto the frame. This was built right. While the rest of America was collapsing into economic ruin, Schwinn was fundamentally innovating. While competitors were slashing standards and cutting corners just to survive the week, Schwinn was raising quality standards. While other companies were going bankrupt, Schwinn was constructing the impenetrable foundation for decades of future dominance. Ignis's brutal pivot was absolutely the correct call. He sacrificed the exciting, non-essential business to save and strengthen the essential one. By focusing everything, better design, better quality control, better marketing, Schwinn emerged from the Great Depression stronger, not weaker, than it entered. By the time World War II arrived, the empire hadn't just weathered the storm, it had become the storm itself. Chapter 5. Postwar Golden Age, 1946. World War II was over. American soldiers flooded home, embraced domestic life, married, and bought houses in the rapidly expanding suburbs. The baby boom was officially underway, and within a few years, those millions of babies were going to require millions of bicycles. But a problem arrived that Schwinn hadn't fully anticipated: Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, European bicycle imports to the U.S. increased tenfold. Hundreds of thousands of units flooded American ports, 95% of them originating from England. British bikes were fundamentally different. They were lighter, far faster, and equipped with sophisticated 3-speed gear mechanisms. Compared to the heavy, single-speed American cruisers, these imports felt like nimble racing machines. Adults who sought exercise, who wanted speed, or who desired a bike more sophisticated than the traditional paperboy model, were buying British. Schwinn's initial reaction was the predictable defensive maneuver: build a comparable model, but keep it proudly American. They produced lightweight geared bikes, but they stubbornly retained the wider tires and larger frame dimensions, the Schwinn signature. It worked reasonably well, but it was a reactive, defensive response, not a visionary one. While his competitors were obsessing over grams and gear ratios, Frank Schwinn was looking at the very architecture of American retail. He realized that a superior product would still die in an inferior system. The real revolution Frank W. Schwinn orchestrated happened around 1950, and it had almost nothing to do with the physical bicycles themselves. It was about distribution. Most American manufacturers were still operating by decades-old rules, selling wholesale to massive department stores like Sears, Montgomery Ward, and J.C. Penney. These stores would slap their own generic private label onto the bikes and sell them as house brands. It was the easy path: guaranteed volume, instant national distribution, and zero need for the manufacturer to worry about marketing. Frank Schwinn looked at this system and saw a fatal systemic flaw. When you sell wholesale to a department store, you surrender control. You lose pricing power. You obliterate your brand identity. A customer walking into Sears saw a dozen different bikes on the floor, some labeled Sears, some Wards, maybe one labeled Schwinn if they even stocked it. How could Schwinn stand out? How could they build loyalty? How could they possibly justify a premium price point when their product sat next to a cheaper, generic alternative on the same rack? The answer: they couldn't. So Frank made a radical, terrifying decision. Schwinn would immediately cease selling to department stores under private labels. They would sell their product only under the Schwinn name, and only directly to independent, specialty bicycle dealers. The only minor exception was Goodrich tire stores, which were specialty automotive shops, not general retailers. It was a massive gamble. Department stores offered guaranteed volume and unparalleled market reach. By cutting them off, Schwinn walked away from the easiest, largest sales channel in America. But Frank was interested in dominance, not ease. In 1952, Frank assembled a new, aggressive management team to execute this audacious strategy. Ray Birch took over marketing. Bill Stews became general manager. Alf Fritz led design. These were not corporate yes-men. They were relentless operators who understood manufacturing, retail psychology, and the absolute necessity of customer experience. They hit the road. Schwinn representatives began visiting independent bike shops nationwide with a potent pitch. Make Schwinn your primary brand, or better yet, your exclusive brand. In exchange for this commitment, the dealer received protected territory. No competitor down the street would carry the same premium product, factory marketing support, and the full weight of the Schwinn name, the most trusted name in children's bicycles. The catch: total compliance. The dealer had to carry the Schwinn logo. No private labeling. They were selling Schwinn bicycles, and every customer who walked through the door had to know it. For dealers, it was an unnerving proposition. Exclusivity meant betting everything on one supplier. If Schwinn failed, they failed. But it also meant they weren't competing directly with the huge department store across town selling a similar product for 20% less. They were selling Schwinn, a premium product with an unassailable reputation. Hundreds of dealers signed the agreement, and the strategy proved brilliant. By the late 1950s, Schwinn had constructed an ironclad, nationwide network of devoted dealers who had a vested interest in pushing Schwinn above all competitors. When a parent walked into a specialty bike shop seeking advice, the dealer didn't offer 5 options. The dealer simply said, "You want a Schwinn." Schwinn controlled the message, controlled the pricing, and controlled the customer experience. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, the factory was running at its relentless peak. This nationwide army of dealers was backed by the heavy metal roar of Chicago's industrial heart. The factory wasn't just producing bikes, it was manufacturing the trust that the dealers sold daily. By the early 1970s, the plant employed 1,800 workers, operating in 3 shifts, churning out well over 1 million bicycles per year. The production floor was a beautiful symphony of welding torches, automated paint booths, and assembly lines. Frames were brazed by hand. Components were individually inspected. Quality control was obsessive because Frank Schwinn understood that the entire delicate business model rested on one thing: reputation. If a Schwinn broke, if a weld failed, or if a customer felt cheated, the entire system collapsed. The dealer lost trust, the customer went elsewhere, the brand died. Quality was non-negotiable. For over 2 decades, from the late 1940s straight through the early 1970s, Schwinn maintained an astounding, unwavering 25% minimum share of the American bicycle market. 1 out of every 4 bikes sold in the United States was a Schwinn. This dominance was not luck or historical accident. It was the direct, profitable result of a visionary distribution strategy so effective that business schools would study it for generations. Schwinn was not the biggest simply because they made excellent bikes, though they did. They were the biggest because they flawlessly controlled the experience of how those bikes reached the customers. They had built a system where everyone in the chain, manufacturer, dealer, and customer, benefited profoundly from choosing the Schwinn name. This was the golden age. This was the absolute peak. This is the empire at full power, radiating confidence, appearing utterly unstoppable. Chapter 6: The Stingray Phenomenon. The early 1960s. The golden sunlight of Southern California was illuminating a shift that the Schwinn boardroom in Chicago couldn't possibly have predicted. Kids, driven by pure organic impulse, were treating standard bicycles not as transport, but as raw material. They were creating a new kind of machine through what amounted to bicycle heresy. The standard frames were being drastically modified. The geometry of suburbia was being subverted. Smaller 20-inch wheels were installed, providing a lower center of gravity. Long, upholstered banana seats were bolted on, often with shock-absorbing struts. Crucially, the handlebars were replaced with imposing, dramatically high-rise bars known as ape hangers, and tall sissy bars were added to the back. They were transforming bicycles into miniature choppers, direct imitations of the customized motorcycles their older brothers were building in sweltering garage workshops, a 2-wheeled extension of the booming hot rod culture. It was a true, fast-spreading grassroots movement that Schwinn, with its top-down Chicago perspective, should have missed entirely. Al Fritz didn't travel to California to find a new bicycle. He went to observe the market. But once there, he stood frozen as he witnessed the heretical creations of these kids. They weren't riding to get to school. They were flying across the pavement with defiant, soaring wheelies. Where others saw ruined bicycles, Fritz, with the eye of a visionary product developer, saw a market segment that had never existed: the muscle bike. He realized that Schwinn didn't need to teach kids how to ride. Schwinn needed to sell them a dream of speed and rebellion. But Al Fritz, Schwinn's sharp-eyed director of research and development, was different. During a reconnaissance trip to California, he caught wind of the trend. He watched the kids performing stunts, popping controlled wheelies, dragging the sissy bars, and showing off their bespoke creations. He didn't see a fleeting game. He saw a seismic cultural shift. He saw the future. Fritz rushed back to Chicago, energized, and pitched the idea to the Schwinn management team. "We need to mass-produce this. We must build a bike that looks like a custom chopper, manufactured straight from the factory floor." The response was immediate and deeply revealing of the corporate mindset: outright laughter. The stiff executives thought the design was ridiculous. It was impractical, ergonomically questionable, and certainly didn't fit the dignified, family-focused image Schwinn had cultivated for decades. "Parents will never buy their children a bike that screams rebellion," one executive scoffed. Fritz refused to back down. He kept pushing, armed with photographs and market observations. Eventually, Frank Schwinn, while skeptical, gave him a grudging green light, but with severe limitations. They wouldn't risk placing it in the main catalog. Instead, they would test it quietly, exclusively through direct dealer sales, to see if the California madness would actually spread. In 1963, the Schwinn Stingray hit the market. It featured a short frame, high-rise handlebars, the signature banana seat, and the essential 20-inch rear wheel. It arrived in colors that violently rejected the subdued palette of previous decades: flamboyant red, flamboyant lime, sky blue, and radiant copper tone. It looked aggressive, new, and utterly desirable. The laughter in the boardroom died a sudden silent death when the sales figures began to roll in. Money, it turned out, spoke much louder than corporate tradition. In a matter of months, the ridiculous design had become a national sensation. The reception was volcanic. Kids went absolutely berserk for it. The Stingray's short wheelbase and rearward weight distribution made it the perfect machine for wheelies. It was easy to yank the front end up and ride, proving status with every gravity-defying maneuver. Every kid in the neighborhood suddenly needed this ultimate show-off bike. Sales exploded instantly. Between 1963 and 1968, Schwinn sold nearly 2 million Stingrays. 2 million. It rapidly became the single best-selling bicycle in Schwinn's history, dwarfing every cruiser, every lightweight, and every previous model they had ever produced. The Stingray wasn't merely a product. It was a defining cultural icon of suburban childhood in the 1960s, instantly recognizable, deeply aspirational. Sensing they had struck a vein of gold, Schwinn began iterating furiously. In 1965, they released the fastback model, which featured a slick, almost bald rear tire, taking direct inspiration from the aesthetics of drag racing, where such tires were believed to offer better grip on the pavement. The bikes looked faster, meaner, and more aggressive. Then, in 1966, Schwinn added Pure Theater, a 5-speed stick shift, an actual gear lever mounted prominently on the frame, styled exactly like the transmission in a Pontiac GTO muscle car. The mechanism didn't dramatically improve performance. It didn't need to. It was about the attitude, the aggressive feel, the illusion of mechanical power transferred to a kid's bicycle. Finally, in 1968, Schwinn pushed the concept to its extravagant peak. They launched the Crate series, the most over-the-top, outrageously styled, and performance-focused Stingrays ever built. The first 3 models, the Orange Crate, the Lemon Peeler, and the Apple Crate, were named after their colors and styled explicitly after California dragsters. The Crate was engineered to be the undisputed baddest bike on the block. It was not cheap. Starting price was $86.95, which represented serious discretionary income in 1968. A standard Stingray cost around $40. But the Crate justified the premium. It featured a powerful front drum brake, a rear caliper or disc brake, a custom suspension banana seat, the 5-speed stick shift, and chrome components everywhere, often including spring-action Springer front forks. These bikes were engineered for genuine performance and status. Kids saved their allowance, mowed every lawn in sight, and begged their parents for months just to acquire one. Schwinn sold 150,000 crates annually during the early years. While not the volume of the standard Stingray, for a premium product priced at double the cost, the numbers were staggering. The crate became the aspirational machine, the one that separated serious riders from the posers. For a full decade, the Stingray phenomenon utterly dominated Schwinn's business. It was more than a bestseller. It was a cultural juggernaut that competitors desperately tried to copy. Huffy, Murray, and every other major manufacturer rushed out their own versions, but none captured the magic. Schwinn got there first, executed it flawlessly, and owned the category entirely. By 1973, the crate line was quietly discontinued. The muscle bike craze was fading as trends shifted, but the impact was permanent. The Stingray and the crate defined an era, generated hundreds of millions in revenue, and cemented Schwinn's reputation as the company that understood the desires of American youth better than anyone else. While the boardroom in Chicago saw bicycles as utility, Al Fritz saw them as fantasy. In 1963, ignored by the skeptics who called his design ugly, Fritz launched the Stingray. It featured high-rise ape-hanger handlebars and a banana seat, mimicking the chopper motorcycles of the Hells Angels. The result was instant hysteria. They sold 45,000 units in months, creating a new category, the muscle bike. By 1968, Fritz escalated the arms race with the Crate series, bikes equipped with stick shifts, suspension, and drum brakes like miniature dragsters. Fritz didn't just sell steel, he sold the feeling of horsepower to kids too young to drive. He famously said, "If you cut my arm, little Schwinn bicycles will flow out." And for a decade, his vision kept the Schwinn empire unmatched. Today, that $87 investment in a 1968 orange crate has outperformed the S&P 500. Because Schwinn built them to last, and kids rode them to destruction, finding a pristine survivor is nearly impossible. In modern auctions, these toys now command prices upwards of $5,000. It turns out, Schwinn didn't just build bikes, they minted heavy metal currency for a generation. This was Schwinn at its absolute peak. This was the empire at maximum power, the moment when every single element, from design innovation, Fritz, to marketing, manufacturing, and the dealer distribution system, was firing in perfect, synchronized harmony. It would never be this good again. Chapter 7. Missing the New Wave. The 1970s marked a profound cultural shift in America. The nation became obsessed with physical fitness. Jogging evolved from a marginal activity into a national pastime. Health clubs and gyms began popping up everywhere. Critically, bicycles were no longer confined to the domain of childhood recreation. Adults wanted them for exercise, for commuting, and for serious weekend recreation. A massive new market was opening up, growing explosively. But the bikes this new generation of adult consumers demanded were not the heavy, durable American cruisers that Schwinn had perfected over half a century. They wanted lightweight road bikes, sleek European models from companies like Raleigh and Peugeot, or precise, competitively priced Japanese imports. These foreign bikes featured thin, high-pressure tires, aggressive drop handlebars, and superior componentry. They weighed literally half what a traditional Schwinn weighed. They were faster, more efficient, and perfectly suited for athletic, long-distance riding. Schwinn's response to this sweeping tidal wave of change was one of institutional denial. Keep building the same heavy-framed bikes they had always built. They added a few more gears, sure, they tweaked the styling, but fundamentally, when the market clamored for finely tuned sports cars, Schwinn was still mass-producing tanks. While his competitors were obsessing over grams and gear ratios, Frank Schwinn was looking at the very architecture of American retail. He realized that a superior product would still die in an inferior system. Ignaz Schwinn didn't just build bikes, he built a fortress of steel logic. He believed that if a machine was heavy, durable, and over-engineered, it was invincible. For 80 years, that philosophy made Schwinn the king. But in the end, it was exactly that obsession, the belief that heavy meant quality, that turned their greatest strength into a fatal anchor, dragging the company to the bottom when the world decided it wanted to fly. It was the first, loudest, and most ignored warning sign. Meanwhile, back in Southern California, Another, more disruptive shift was occurring, ironically using Schwinn's own invention. Kids were taking their Stingrays, stripped of their ornamentation, onto dirt lots. They were racing them, building makeshift ramps, sliding around corners, and brutally abusing the bikes in ways they were never designed to handle. It was rough, dangerous, and it exploded in popularity. Bicycle motocross, BMX, was born. Entrepreneurs quickly capitalized. In 1976, Skip Hess founded Mongoose Bicycle Company specifically to build bikes that could survive this new sport. Gary Turner's GT bicycles quickly became another major force. These were not toy companies. They were engineering bicycles with reinforced frames, aggressive knobby tires, and components designed to survive brutal, high-impact terrain. Schwinn looked at BMX and saw only liability. It was too dangerous, too niche, and fundamentally didn't align with the family-friendly, quality-focused image they had so carefully cultivated. Parents will sue us if their kids get hurt, management rationalized. So Schwinn sat it out, allowing Mongoose and GT to own the entire nascent category. Then came the true challenge. In 1974, a mechanic and visionary named Gary Fisher did something that should have triggered a corporate emergency meeting. He took an old 1937 Schwinn Excelsior frame, one of the heavy, durable cruisers from the Golden Age, and modified it with a cluster of gears, powerful brakes, and rugged tires. He took this ruggedized Frankenstein machine up into the mountains of Marin County, California, and rode it full speed down fire trails. He had just invented the mountain bike. It was the ultimate irony. The future of the industry was being forged from the literal bones of Schwinn's past, yet the company's leaders were too blinded by heritage to see the revolution happening right under their tires. Fisher brought his creation to Schwinn, presenting it to their engineers in Chicago, explaining the concept of off-road cycling and rugged terrain. The Schwinn engineers openly laughed at him. Why would anyone want to ride a bicycle in the dirt? That's not what bikes are for, was the prevailing attitude. Frank the Schwinn, the great-grandson of Ignatz, who was now running the company, actively dismissed the entire idea. He felt personally insulted that people were chopping up vintage Schwinn frames for this ridiculous hobby. It was viewed as disrespecting the brand's heritage. While Schwinn was deaf to the future, a young entrepreneur named Mike Sinyard was listening. In 1981, his company, Specialized, started importing specialized components for mountain biking from Japan. In 1982, Specialized released the Stump Jumper, the first mass-produced mountain bike. It was an instant, overwhelming hit. Within a few years, mountain biking went from a fringe activity to a massive mainstream sport. Bike shops couldn't keep the frames in stock, and Schwinn was still confidently dismissing it as a fad. Simultaneously, Trek Bicycle Corporation, founded in 1976 in a Wisconsin barn, was focusing exclusively on lightweight road bikes for affluent adults. Trek targeted serious cyclists willing to pay premium prices, starting around $279. They weren't competing in Schwinn's children's market. They were building an entirely new category, one Schwinn refused to acknowledge existed. By 1980, the empire was under attack on multiple critical fronts. The Chicago factory, the plant that had been operating since the early 1900s, was falling apart. It was dark, soot-stained, structurally inefficient, and incapable of producing the precise, lightweight frames the modern market demanded. Modern materials like chrome moly required different welding techniques and tighter tolerances, equipment the factory didn't have and couldn't accommodate. Then the union went on strike. The relationship between the Schwinn family management and the factory workers had been tense for years, but now it was openly hostile. But the friction wasn't just about wages. It was a clash of cultures. For decades, the factory had been run on Ignatz's old-world paternalism, a handshake deal where loyalty was traded for job security. But by 1980, the workforce had changed. The old German and Polish craftsmen were gone, replaced by a younger, diverse generation that didn't feel any familial bond to a distant CEO like Ed Schwinn Jr. When the workers voted to join the United Auto Workers, UAW, in 1980, the Schwinn family took it personally. They viewed the unionization not as a business negotiation, but as a betrayal. Schwinn didn't just look for help, They opened the floodgates to a partner they had been testing since 1977, Giant Bicycles. The strike turned a modest outsourcing experiment into a desperate dependency. Almost overnight, Schwinn handed their blueprints in massive volume to Taiwan, effectively teaching Giant how to become a global superpower. This wasn't a partnership of equals, it was a slow-motion abdication. By handing over their blueprints to bypass a strike, Schwinn didn't just find a supplier, they spent the next decade meticulously building their own executioner. Schwinn had actually begun testing the waters with a Taiwanese manufacturer named Giant as early as 1977. But the 1980 strike turned a tentative experiment into a desperate dependency. To bypass the picket lines in Chicago, Schwinn didn't just place orders, they effectively handed over their engineering blueprints and production volume to Giant, accelerating the Taiwanese firm's learning curve by a decade. Giant wasn't just a discovery, they were the contingency plan that swallowed the host. The strike ultimately ended, but the trust was shattered. Ed Schwinn Jr. reportedly felt that he could no longer control his own factory floor, and if he couldn't control it, he would kill it. The Schwinn family made a chilling, calculated decision. They would not invest another dime in the antiquated Chicago plant. Instead, they would build a brand new factory in Greenville, Mississippi, a right-to-work state where unions had zero power. The goal? Salvation through relocation. In 1981, the Greenville plant opened. It was meant to be the modern, state-of-the-art facility that would restore American manufacturing and allow Schwinn to compete head-to-head with the quality imports. That was the audacious, high-stakes plan. Meanwhile, back in the market, disaster followed misstep. In 1982, Schwinn finally, reluctantly, tried to enter the mountain bike market. They released the Sidewinder. It wasn't a mountain bike. It was their old heavy Varsity or Continental model with cheap, fat tires bolted onto the frame. It featured zero engineering innovation and demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of what mountain bikers actually needed. The market immediately saw through the half-hearted effort. A year later, in 1983, Schwinn released the Sierra, a legitimate chrome moly mountain bike that was actually well-designed. But here was the kicker. It was manufactured by Giant in Taiwan. Schwinn didn't build it themselves. By this point, they were a full decade late to a market that Specialized, Trek, and others had already utterly dominated. In June 1983, Schwinn shut down the Chicago factory. 1,800 workers received pink slips. The plant that had built the Stingray, the Aerocycle, and the foundational bikes of American childhood for generations was shut down forever. The last Chicago-made Schwinn rolled off the line, and with it, an entire glorious era ended. Schwinn had missed BMX. They had missed mountain bikes. They had missed the lightweight road bike boom. They missed every major trend that defined the 1970s and early 1980s. And now, they had willfully destroyed the manufacturing heart of their own company. The empire was crumbling, and the family running it was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the reality. Chapter 8: The Greenville Gamble. The crisis was existential by 1980. The Chicago factory floor, a dark, sprawling labyrinth smelling of oil and sweat, was literally disintegrating. Workers walked off the line demanding safer conditions and better pay. The Schwinn family saw a 90-year-old building that was a structural liability filled with outdated machinery and fire hazards. They saw escalating union demands. They saw red. The plant was physically incapable of manufacturing the lightweight, high-tolerance frames the modern market demanded. The Schwinn family refused the massive investment required for modernization. Their decision was final. They were done with Chicago. The paralysis wasn't just about stubbornness, it was structural. Ignaz Schwinn had locked the company into a family trust back in the 1920s to keep it safe. But by the 1980s, that safety net had turned into a noose. The trust was designed to prevent outsiders from taking over, but now it prevented the company from raising the cash needed to save itself. They were strangled by their own protection. Ownership was fractured among 16 different heirs, many of whom didn't care about bicycles, they cared about dividends. While competitors like Trek were reinvesting every dollar into R&D and aluminum technology, the Schwinn heirs were treating the company like a personal ATM, demanding payouts even as cash reserves ran dry. Ed Schwinn Jr. was the CEO, but he was financially handcuffed. He couldn't take the company public, IPO, or bring in outside investors because the trust was terrified of diluting their control. They chose to rule a sinking ship rather than share a floating one. So, when the Chicago factory needed millions for upgrades, the answer was a hard no. They didn't have the cash, and they refused to raise it. While Trek and Specialized were lean, agile hunters in a new market, Schwinn was a dinosaur tied to a stake by its own legal history. The very wall Ignaz built to keep the world out had finally become a tomb that kept the future from getting in. Faced with this internal paralysis, the family saw only one desperate way out. They ignored the warnings, doubled down on their pride, and went all in on the massive gamble known as Greenville. In 1981, Schwinn announced the construction of a brand new factory in Greenville, Mississippi. The plan was sophisticated, on paper. Build a state-of-the-art American manufacturing facility that could produce premium, high-quality bicycles to compete with Trek. The cheap, basic models could be imported from Asia, but the high-end, profitable models would carry the Made in America tag, produced in Mississippi. Greenville was chosen for specific, cold financial reasons. It was a right-to-work state, neutralizing the power of unions. The state offered lucrative tax incentives, and labor was significantly cheaper than in Chicago. Build modern, union-free, cost-effective, the American manufacturing dream updated for the ruthless 1980s economy. Except for one massive, overlooked problem. Nobody had accounted for basic geography. Greenville was logistically in the middle of nowhere. The factory sat 75 miles from the nearest major interstate highway. For management flying in from Chicago, the commute was absurd. Fly to Memphis, catch a tiny puddle jumper to a regional airport, then endure a 3-hour drive through the rural Mississippi Delta. Schwinn management began joking bitterly that it was literally easier to get to their suppliers in Taiwan than to visit their own factory in Greenville. They had prioritized the absence of unions over the presence of a viable infrastructure. In their flight from the labor struggles of the North, they had landed in a logistical desert where the cost of moving parts soon outweighed the savings on wages. Logistics were just the start of the catastrophe. Greenville was a small delta town surrounded by cotton fields and catfish farms, lacking deep industrial infrastructure. There was no established talent pool of experienced welders or high-precision metal workers. Schwinn had to train their workforce from scratch, and even with the best efforts, the skill level never matched the decades of institutional experience they had abandoned in Chicago. Worse, the supply chain became a disaster. Components were sourced from Asia, shipped across the Pacific to West Coast ports, trucked across the continent, and then transported down to rural Mississippi. Every unnecessary step added cost, complexity, and delays. The entire operation was fighting a losing battle against geography and economics. In June 1983, the Chicago factory closed for good. 88 years of operation ended. 1,800 loyal workers lost their livelihoods in a single day. The fate of the entire company now rested on the Mississippi plant, a place that needed to work perfectly to justify the monumental decision. It did not. Schwinn didn't just move a factory, they lobotomized their production. They traded century-old craftsmen in Chicago for untrained hands in the Mississippi Delta, expecting that cheaper wages could somehow weld straight frames. They were wrong. From 1983 to 1991, Greenville was a slow-motion catastrophe of spiraling costs and inconsistent quality. The bikes emerging from the facility weren't better than the Asian imports. In many cases, they were demonstrably worse. Quality control was erratic. While Mississippi wages were lower than Chicago's, they were still 5, 10, and sometimes 15 times higher than what workers were paid in China or Taiwan. Schwinn was paying American wages to produce bicycles that had to compete directly on price with Asian imports. The mathematical equation was fundamentally flawed. Richard Schwinn, a family member, bravely volunteered to move to Mississippi to personally oversee operations. He implemented better training programs and tighter quality standards. Things improved marginally, but it was far too little, far too late. The Greenville factory never, not once, turned a profit. Every single day it operated, Schwinn was hemorrhaging money into a geographical trap.
By the late 1980s, the reality was undeniable. Greenville was a ruinously expensive mistake. In August 1991, the final, inevitable announcement came down. Greenville was closing. 240 workers received 60-day notices. The manufacturing dream was over. On October 4, 1991, a factory worker punched out after assembling the very last bicycle. It was a standard production model, bike number 247 for the day. Nothing special, nothing ceremonial.
He shut off his station, turned off the lights, and locked the door. The massive machines inside went silent forever. After 96 years of continuous American manufacturing, Schwinn no longer produced bicycles in the United States. The Greenville factory sat empty, a big, silent building in rural Mississippi that was supposed to save an empire, but instead became its tomb. The factory failure was symbolic proof that Schwinn was incapable of adapting to the new global economy. The company had gambled everything on the idea that made in America still mattered enough to the consumer to justify the higher cost. They were catastrophically wrong. Customers cared about weight, performance, price, and features. They did not care about the address on the bottom bracket. Schwinn tried to fight globalization with nostalgia and lost. The silent factory in Greenville stands as a monument to that strategic failure, the place where the last hope died, ending Schwinn's legacy not with a grand ceremony, but with a worker turning off the lights and locking the door behind him, forever. The lights went out on October 4th, but the darkness had been creeping in for a long time. The empire didn't fall to a competitor. It collapsed under the weight of its own refusal to change, leaving behind nothing but a silent building and a hollow name. Chapter 9. The Final Collapse. Schwinn's efforts to catch up in the modern market categories were belated and weak. In 1983, they finally entered the BMX market with the Predator, a legitimate, well-engineered chrome moly frame. It was a good bike, but it arrived at a party that was already over. Mongoose had owned BMX since 1975. Diamondback, GT, and Harrow had been dominating for years. Schwinn was so late that the kids who grew up racing BMX were already teenagers, moving on to cars and other interests. The Predator was a footnote, not a revolution. A year later, in 1984, Schwinn released the High Sierra mountain bike. This time, they actually got it right, a real mountain bike with proper geometry and quality components. Sales doubled year over year for 3 consecutive years. Finally, Schwinn had a hit in a modern category, but the profits were immediately funneled into the black hole of keeping the failing Greenville factory alive. The creation of this lifeline wasn't strategic foresight, it was an accident of corporate warfare. By 1978, the new CEO, Ed Schwinn Jr., wanted to purge the old guard. He viewed Al Fritz, the man who built the Stingray, not as an asset, but as a threat to his authority. In a move widely seen as an exile, Ed pushed Fritz out of the bicycle division and sent him to the suburbs to run a tiny, irrelevant spin-off called Excelsior Fitness. It was supposed to be a career graveyard. Instead, Fritz did what he always did. He innovated. He took a weird idea involving a giant fan and turned it into the Airdyne. While Ed Schwinn Jr. was driving the bicycle division into the ground, the exiled Fritz was selling 67,000 Airdynes a year at massive margins. By 1986, this single machine was generating nearly $40 million in revenue. Ironically, the man Ed tried to fire was the only one keeping the lights on. He developed an exercise bike that used a giant fan instead of a traditional flywheel. The harder the user pedaled, the more resistance they received. It was ingenious and perfectly timed for the mid-1980s fitness craze. In 1986, Schwinn sold 67,000 Airdynes at $595 each, generating nearly $40 million in revenue from a single product with massive profit margins. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Airdyne was the only thing keeping the entire Schwinn Corporation afloat. But the cruelest blow came from a courtroom, not a factory. Seeing the massive success of the Airdyne, retail giant Sears Roebuck launched a cheaper knockoff. Schwinn fought back, pinning their hopes on a patent infringement lawsuit to protect their monopoly on the dual-action technology. In 1990, the gavel fell and Schwinn lost. The court ruled against them, and the patent protection evaporated. Almost overnight, the market was flooded with cheaper competitors. Airdyne sales plummeted by 35%, wiping out $8 million in critical annual profit. This wasn't just a dip in sales, it was the destruction of the company's only remaining financial life raft. The Airdyne wasn't just a product, it was a miracle that bought the family time they didn't deserve. But in the cold world of corporate law, miracles are temporary. When the patent fell, the miracle didn't just end, it turned into a tidal wave of competition that the aging empire was too weak to swim against. As if the bleeding in Mississippi wasn't enough, Schwinn's management decided to open another wound, this time behind the Iron Curtain. In a move that baffled industry experts, the company bought a 45% stake in the Sepal Works factory in Budapest, Hungary, in 1988. The logic was to find cheap labor outside of Asia, but the reality was a nightmare. The factory was a relic of the Soviet era, dilapidated, with leaking roofs and 19th-century technology. The workforce, demoralized by decades of communism, was described as lackadaisical, often preferring the black market over building bicycles. Instead of saving money, Hungary became a money pit. The bikes produced there, like the Woodlands model, were of such poor quality that thousands had to be warehoused or recalled due to faulty brakes, a mistake that cost the cash-strapped company an extra $1 million alone. Schwinn was effectively paying to produce bikes that they couldn't sell, draining critical cash reserves just as the banks began to circle. The bicycle division numbers, however, showed the true terminal decline. In 1987, Schwinn sold 1 million bicycles. In 1991, that number was cut in half to 500,000 units. By 1993, volume plummeted to 275,000. In 6 years, Schwinn lost 73% of its volume. They were in free fall. The truly dangerous part was their dependence on a single supplier. By 1988, Giant Manufacturing in Taiwan was producing 82% of all Schwinn bicycles, roughly 700,000 units. Schwinn had outsourced its entire production to one foreign entity, and Giant knew exactly how much leverage it held. It wasn't theft, it was a gift. In a desperate bid to crush their own union in Chicago, Schwinn handed the keys to the kingdom to a small Taiwanese factory called Giant. They sent blueprints, engineers, and secrets refined over 80 years. They thought they were hiring a servant. Instead, they were training their executioner. Schwinn literally taught their future killer how to hold the gun. It was a move straight out of a corporate spy thriller, and it backfired spectacularly. By 1987, Schwinn realized they had effectively handed the keys to the castle to Giant. With the Taiwanese manufacturer producing over 80% of their volume, Schwinn was no longer the client, they were the hostage. In a desperate bid to regain leverage, Ed Schwinn Jr. executed a secret defense strategy. He purchased a 33% stake in China Bicycles Company, CBC, in Shenzhen, planning to shift production there and cut Giant loose. He thought he was playing 4D chess. But Giant didn't just get mad, they got even. Giant saw the writing on the wall long before the China Bicycles deal. Having watched Schwinn erratically shift production to Mississippi and then Hungary, Giant's executives realized their biggest client was unstable. They didn't launch the Giant brand purely out of spite. It was a survival strategy. By the time Schwinn tried to pivot to China in 1987, Giant was already prepared to go direct to consumer in the US, leveraging the very efficiency Schwinn had taught them. Giant's retaliation was calculated with surgical precision. They didn't just launch a competing brand, they weaponized Schwinn's own product against them. Giant representatives approached the very same American dealers that Schwinn relied on and made an offer that was impossible to refuse. They presented bicycles that were virtually identical to the Schwinn models, welded on the same jigs, by the same hands, in the same Taiwanese factory, but offered them at a 15% discount. It was a masterstroke of economic warfare. Schwinn was effectively subsidizing its own executioner. Dealers, already tired of Schwinn's supply shortages and arrogance, looked at the cold math. The same bike, higher margins, and better inventory availability. They didn't just buy a few Giants, they shifted their loyalty overnight. Giant didn't just enter the market, they occupied it, using Schwinn's own DNA. It was a masterclass in irony. The very precision and efficiency that Ignaz Schwinn had spent a lifetime perfecting were now being used as a scalpel by his former protege to cut the throat of his legacy. Ed Schwinn bought 33% of the China Bicycle Company, believing he was buying loyalty. In reality, he bought complacency. The Chinese partner knew Schwinn had burned its bridges with Giant, so they didn't rush to fix their quality issues. Schwinn wasn't a partner, they were a captive hostage in their own deal. This situation was made worse by the man at the helm, Edward Schwinn Jr. If Ignaz Schwinn was the architect who built the empire with grease and grit, Ed was the aristocrat who ruled it with hubris. He didn't view the company as a machine to be oiled, he viewed it as a piggy bank to be raided. He treated dealer loyalty not as a partnership, but as a feudal right. When longtime dealers began defecting to Trek due to inventory shortages, Ed didn't ask why. He took it as a personal insult, famously sending vindictive letters to shop owners rather than fixing his broken supply chain. Ed was a deal maker, not a caretaker. He constantly chased acquisitions and new ventures, anything except fixing the core manufacturing and design problems. Crucially, he systematically alienated and fired or drove away multiple senior executives, experienced managers who understood distribution, manufacturing, and the bicycle industry. These veterans, armed with decades of institutional knowledge, went straight to the competition. Trek hired them. Specialized hired them. Schwinn effectively handed its competitors the operational playbook. Meanwhile, the relationship with Asian suppliers quickly deteriorated. Giant and China Bicycles weren't just manufacturers, they were now creditors. Schwinn owed them massive sums for bikes already produced and shipped. When Giant launched its own branded bicycles, it became both Schwinn's supplier and its direct competitor, the ultimate conflict of interest. By the late 1980s, the financial noose was tightening. Schwinn's warehouses were overflowing with unsold inventory, bikes nobody wanted, sitting in boxes, depreciating rapidly. They couldn't pay their Asian manufacturers. Giant and China Bicycles demanded cash on delivery. Pay up front or we stop production. No more credit, no more terms. Banks noticed the sales decline, the inventory crisis, and the mounting debt. They tightened credit. Schwinn could no longer borrow its way out. By 1992, the numbers were catastrophic. Market share had collapsed from 25% to a negligible 5%. Total debt stood at $82 million. Losses over the previous 3 years exceeded $50 million. In 1992 alone, Schwinn was losing $25 million, over $2 million every month with no hope of a turnaround. Dealers, nervous about the future, switched to Trek, Specialized, and Giant, brands that weren't on the verge of collapse. The arrogance wasn't limited to the boardroom. It targeted the very people keeping the company alive, the loyal dealers. In one infamous incident, a longtime Texas dealer, who had bled Schwinn blue for decades, finally renamed his shop Bike World to sell Trek bicycles, simply because Schwinn couldn't deliver enough inventory to keep his doors open. Ed Schwinn Jr.'s response wasn't to fix the supply chain, it was a personal vendetta. He sent a handwritten letter to the shop owner, his own partner, stating, "You had some nerve. I would never forget this." He chose spite over strategy. Instead of asking why his dealers were leaving, he declared war on them. That dealer went on to become one of the top Trek retailers in the nation, while Ed Schwinn was left holding a grudge that helped dismantle his own distribution network. On August 26, 1992, COO Ralph Day Murray walked into a board meeting and delivered the message everyone already knew but had refused to articulate. There is no savior coming. No white knight investor, no bailout, no last-minute miracle. It is over. The boardroom, once filled with the smoke of expensive cigars and the unshakable arrogance of a century-old dynasty, fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The myth of invincibility had finally run out of road, leaving only the cold, hard math of ruin. 6 weeks later, on October 7, 1992, Schwinn filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 97 years as a continuous family-owned business, finished. The company that had survived the bicycle bubble burst of 1900, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars was now insolvent, and the family had lost all control. The bankruptcy itself dissolved into a legal nightmare. The Schwinn family trust technically owned the trademark, the name Schwinn itself, and they demanded compensation. Creditors fought the family trust over payment priority, with lawyers arguing over the residual value of a brand that had been systematically driven into the ground. Giant and China Bicycles, as the largest creditors, were not feeling charitable. They wanted their money and were prepared to carve up Schwinn's assets to get it. The company that once defined American bicycles was being picked apart in a courtroom. Factories closed, the workforce gone, dealers abandoned, inventory liquidated. The Schwinn name, once synonymous with quality and childhood joy, was now just another asset being auctioned off to the highest bidder. This was the final collapse. Ignaz Schwinn came to America in 1891 and built a dynasty from nothing. 3 generations later, his great-grandson, Edward Jr., watched it disintegrate. It failed not because of bad luck or unforeseeable forces, but because of strategic failures, catastrophic poor leadership, and a fundamental inability to adapt when the world changed. Schwinn wasn't beaten by better bikes. They were beaten by better decisions made by competitors who saw the future and moved toward it, while Schwinn clung stubbornly to a glorious past. Chapter 10. The Silent Factory Speaks. Greenville, Mississippi. Today, if you drive down Highway 82 and turn onto the old industrial road, you will find it. The Schwinn factory, or what remains of it, a large anonymous metal shell, a corporate monument to misplaced hope and corporate hubris. The building still stands today, a colossal anonymous metal shell baking under the Mississippi sun. It is utterly empty, abandoned, and profoundly silent. Weeds push aggressively through fissures in the asphalt parking lot, reclaiming the ground where thousands of new bicycles once waited for transport. Windows are shattered, gazing out like vacant eyes. The immense Schwinn sign is so bleached and weather-beaten that the corporate logo is almost illegible. And there, affixed to a rusted gate, is a for sale notice, the paper yellowed and curled by years of neglect. This building, the Greenville factory, was intended to be Schwinn's salvation. It was the final, desperate gamble, the place where American manufacturing, powered by nostalgia and pride, was supposed to prove it could still compete against the rising tide of global production. Instead, it became Schwinn's tomb. The machinery has been silent since 1991, over 3 decades of nothingness. No assembly lines hum, no time clock stamps the arrival of hopeful workers, and certainly no iconic chrome bicycles roll off the final line. There is only emptiness, accelerated decay, and the suffocating weight of failure. This factory is the perfect, tragic symbol for the death of American bicycle dominance. And if you stand close enough to that deafening silence, you can distinctly hear 3 essential lessons echoing, lessons every business, every industrial empire must heed. Lesson 1. Innovate or die. Schwinn looked at the aggressive, low-slung design of BMX bikes and dismissed them as a fleeting teenage fad. They viewed mountain biking, born in the hills of Northern California, as a niche joke championed by fringe hippies. They literally watched Gary Fisher, one of the pioneers of the sport, ride a modified Schwinn frame down a mountain in 1974 and reportedly laughed him out of the room. This refusal to recognize nascent market trends was corporate arrogance defined. Meanwhile, while Schwinn was busy celebrating its past, its competitors were defining the future. Skip Hess founded Mongoose, captured the emerging BMX street culture, and owned that category. Mike Sinyard launched Specialized, focusing on high-performance materials and dominating the technical mountain biking market. Trek, focusing on precision, lightweight road bikes, captured the affluent adult demographic. These were not accidents or lucky guesses. These were entrepreneurs paying meticulous attention to what the next generation of customers actually wanted. Schwinn had the legacy, the brand recognition, the ironclad dealer network, and the manufacturing expertise. They could have owned all 3 emerging categories instantly had they moved swiftly and taken the trends seriously. They didn't. They clung to the delusional belief that their name alone was sufficient, assuming customers would keep buying the old models just because they always had. They were catastrophically wrong. Your reputation buys you time, but it doesn't buy you permanence. The instant you cease innovating, the process of dying begins. It makes no difference how large your market share is or how long you have reigned supreme. The market does not care about your legacy. It cares intensely about what you are offering right now. Schwinn forgot this, and the consequences were terminal. Lesson 2. The past can't save the future. The Greenville factory was more than just a new facility. It was an attempt to physically go backward in time. Schwinn desperately sought to recapture the glory days of Made in America, where quality and unparalleled craftsmanship were believed to justify premium pricing, and their head badge alone guaranteed a sale. But the 1980s heralded a fundamental change in global economics. Manufacturing had become ruthlessly efficient and transnational. Taiwan, China, and Japan were producing bikes of equal or superior quality at a fraction of the cost. Giant, the Taiwanese giant, could build a better, lighter frame for less money than Schwinn could spend just on labor and raw materials in Mississippi. Customers noticed the disparity. In this new reality, Made in America ceased being a competitive advantage. It became a significant cost disadvantage. Schwinn poured millions into Greenville, attempting to prove otherwise. All they succeeded in proving was that nostalgia, when applied as a business strategy, is ruinous. Trek understood this necessity for adaptation. They maintained some domestic assembly while aggressively sourcing high-quality components and frames overseas, utilizing the best of both worlds. Specialized outsourced almost entirely, transforming itself into a design, engineering, and marketing powerhouse. Giant became the masterful manufacturer and a powerful brand simultaneously. They adapted their structure to the new world. Schwinn, paralyzed by pride, refused. They clung to an outdated idea of what they used to be, instead of accepting the painful truth of what they needed to become. The silent factory in Greenville stands as the physical monument to that fatal inflexibility. Lesson 3. Management matters more than legacy. The founding fathers of the company were titans. Ignaz Schwinn was a genius, a ruthless visionary who survived the 1900 bicycle bubble by acquiring bankrupt competitors. He navigated the Great Depression by shuttering his profitable motorcycle division and committing everything to bicycles. He possessed discipline and the guts for brutal, necessary decision-making. His son, Frank W. Schwinn, was just as brilliant an executor. Frank established the dealer network that dominated American retail for decades, and critically, launched the Stingray, the best-selling bike in company history. He balanced innovation with flawless execution. But the third generation, embodied by Edward Schwinn Jr., simply did not inherit the necessary capacity. By all accounts, Ed was a decent man, but decency is a poor substitute for passion, rigor, and vision when running an industrial empire. He lacked genuine passion for the product. He preferred chasing vague real estate deals and financial restructuring over the tedious, necessary work of managing operations. Most damagingly, he fired or alienated the executives who actually understood modern manufacturing and marketing. These displaced talents didn't retire. They walked straight across the street to Trek and Specialized, taking with them decades of accumulated Schwinn knowledge and trade secrets. A family legacy does not guarantee competent leadership. Blood relation does not transfer talent or grit. When you put a person in charge who is simply incapable of meeting the demands of the job, the empire collapses, regardless of how strong the foundation was laid. Schwinn learned this lesson the hardest way possible. But the lessons of the past were ignored by the scavengers of the future. The bankruptcy didn't lead to a rebirth. It led to a corporate lobotomy where the brand was stripped of its brain and sold for its skin. The aftermath and the final warning. What became of the corpse of the empire? In January 1993, the investor Sam Zell and his Chillmark fund purchased Schwinn out of its initial bankruptcy for $40 million. The 1993 buyout wasn't a rescue, it was the start of a chaotic purgatory. The new owners, investment group Zell Chillmark and later Quester Partners, tried desperately to fake a heartbeat. They moved the headquarters to Boulder, Colorado, the mecca of the very mountain biking culture Schwinn had ignored, hoping to absorb some credibility by osmosis. For a brief moment, it almost worked. They launched the legendary Homegrown series, legitimate, high-performance mountain bikes built in the USA by cult favorite Yeti cycles. Critics loved them. But financial engineering is not brand loyalty. The 1993 buyout wasn't a rescue, it was the start of a chaotic purgatory. The new owners, investment group Zell Chilmark and Scott Sports, tried desperately to fake a heartbeat. They moved the headquarters to Boulder, Colorado, the mecca of the very mountain biking culture Schwinn had ignored, hoping to absorb some credibility by osmosis. For a brief moment, it almost worked. They launched the Homegrown series, legitimate, high-performance mountain bikes built in the USA by Yeti Cycles. Critics loved them. But financial engineering is not brand loyalty. The company was flipped again in 1997 to Quester Partners, who saddled it with even more debt by merging it with GT Bicycles. In 1998, the owners saddled the company with even more debt by merging it with GT Bicycles, creating a house of cards built on leveraged loans. By 2001, the weight of that debt crushed the reboot. Schwinn filed for Chapter 11 a second time. This was the true end. The brand was auctioned off to Pacific Cycle, a mass-market importer. The transition from American industrial icon to a sticker on a box in Walmart was finally complete. In the ultimate act of historical cruelty, the law protected the sticker, but abandoned the soul. A name built on blood and steel was now owned by lawyers, while the bloodline itself was rendered nameless. The tragic irony of Schwinn is that after the family lost control, the smart money did even worse. First came the grave dancer. In 1993, Sam Zell's investment group bought Schwinn not because they loved cycling, but because they loved distressed assets. Their mistake was cultural lobotomy. They moved the headquarters to Boulder to chase the mountain bike trend, but fired the Chicago loyalists who actually knew how to run the supply chain. They treated a manufacturing icon like a financial spreadsheet, stripping away assets, including selling the legendary Paramount factory, to focus on mass market volume. Then came the debt bomb. In 1997, Quester Partners took over and committed the fatal error of leverage. They acquired GT Bicycles for roughly $170 million and merged it with Schwinn, creating a Frankenstein monster stitched together with massive debt. They bet everything on a generic growth at all costs strategy. When the market softened in 2001, the weight of those loans crushed the company instantly, leading to the second, final bankruptcy. Finally, the commoditization. Pacific Cycle bought the scraps in 2001 and made the final, irreversible decision. They put Schwinn in Walmart. They took a brand that once commanded wait lists at specialty dealers and turned it into a budget item sitting next to lawn mowers and detergent. The logo survived, but the prestige was officially dead. The venerable name was sold to Pacific Cycle, which was later acquired by Durrell Industries of Canada, which eventually offloaded it to Pawn Holdings, a Dutch conglomerate specializing in active lifestyle brands. Today, Schwinn bikes are manufactured almost exclusively in China and distributed globally through high-volume big-box retailers. The 1993 bankruptcy wasn't just a financial restructuring, it was a corporate lobotomy. The company was bought by investment group Zell Chilmark and moved to Boulder, Colorado. For a brief moment, they tried to reclaim their soul with the Homegrown series, fantastic mountain bikes built by Yeti, but the financial hole was too deep. By 2001, they were bankrupt again, sold to Pacific Cycle, and destined for the discount aisles of Walmart. But the true tragedy lies in a small factory in Wisconsin. When the empire crumbled, Richard Schwinn, Ignaz's great-grandson, managed to buy the old Paramount factory in Waterford. He continued building world-class, hand-brazed steel bicycles, keeping the original craftsmanship alive. But there was a cruel catch. Because the corporation owned the trademark, Richard was legally forbidden from putting his own last name on the bikes he built. The only man who carried the Schwinn bloodline and talent couldn't use the brand, while a conglomerate stamped Schwinn on millions of cheap imports. The soul in the name had been permanently severed. The brand survives. You can still purchase a Schwinn at Walmart or Target, but the soul, the craftsmanship, the identity is utterly gone. It is now merely a nameplate, a logo stamped onto mass-market bicycles that bear no connection to the engineering integrity Ignaz Schwinn established in 1895. In the wreckage of the bankruptcy, fate played a bitterly ironic prank. Richard Schwinn, the great-grandson of the founder, Ignaz, fought to buy back the old factory machinery to keep the flickering flame of tradition alive. Yet, in a cruel twist, because the Schwinn trademark had been sold off by the corporation to settle debts, Richard was legally forbidden from stamping his own family name on the bicycles he built. Imagine that. The only man carrying the authentic Schwinn bloodline was barred from using the name, while corporate entities casually slapped it onto millions of cheap imports. The last thread connecting a glorious past to the present resided only at Waterford Precision Cycles, a small workshop in Wisconsin founded by Richard in 1993. Here, only a few hundred handcrafted bikes are born each year, with a level of meticulousness that has long been extinct. It is a melancholy ballad, a fallen empire now withdrawn into a corner of quiet, stubborn pride. But in June 2023, the final ember of the Schwinn industrial legacy flickered out. Richard Schwinn, the last family member building bikes on American soil, closed the doors of the Waterford factory for good. It wasn't a bankruptcy this time, it was a reality check. Richard was 69 years old, and his master craftsmen, the welders and brazers who held decades of irreplaceable skill in their hands, were retiring alongside him. In a world dominated by mass-produced carbon fiber, they simply couldn't find a new generation willing or able to inherit the torch of handcrafted steel. As Richard put it, the streak is over. The machinery was sold, the lights were turned off, and the 130-year chain of Schwinn family manufacturing was finally, voluntarily, broken. The soul of the machine didn't sell out, it simply retired. The sticker on the tube still says Schwinn, but the ghost of Ignaz has long since left the building. The empire didn't just fall, it faded into a hollow echo, reminding us that even the mightiest steel can eventually turn to dust if it loses its heart. In the wreckage of the bankruptcy, there was one final, cruel twist of irony that defined the tragedy of the Schwinn dynasty. Richard Schwinn, Edward's cousin and the only family member who truly understood high-end manufacturing, managed to salvage a single piece of the empire, the Paramount Design Group factory in Waterford, Wisconsin. He bought the machinery and the building, intending to keep the flame of handcrafted American steel alive. But the bankruptcy court had sold the Schwinn name and the Paramount trademark to the corporate vultures. This meant that Richard, a direct descendant of Ignaz, was legally forbidden from putting his own last name on the bicycles he built. While huge conglomerates slapped the Schwinn logo on millions of mass-produced units in China, Richard was forced to brand his world-class bicycles as Waterford Precision Cycles. The family retained the talent, but lost the legacy. The soul of the company survived in a small Wisconsin workshop, but the world only recognized the ghost sold in the aisles of Walmart. The silent factory speaks its final words. Stand outside the Greenville factory today. Look at the jagged glass, the overgrown lot, the rusted perimeter fencing. This is not merely the story of Schwinn's demise. This is the definitive story of an entire era of American manufacturing coming to a devastating close. This is the consequence of businesses that stop listening to their customers. This is what happens when companies assume the rules that led to past success will endure indefinitely. This is the result of choosing corporate pride over pragmatic adaptation. This is the fate of those who allow nostalgia to utterly cloud commercial judgment. The silent factory doesn't just represent Schwinn's failure. It represents every business that thought it was too big to collapse. Every empire that believed its powerful name alone would afford protection. Every company that utterly missed the future because it was too focused on celebrating the past. Ignaz Schwinn arrived in America with nothing and built the largest bicycle company in the world. 3 generations later, his great-grandson watched that creation buckle under the weight of its own complacency and collapse into bankruptcy, sold off in pieces to satisfy creditors. 97 years, from immigrant engineer to industrial titan to corporate corpse. The Schwinn factory in Greenville, Mississippi sits silent, empty, forgotten. It is a monument to ambition, arrogance, and the unforgiving, perpetual dynamism of capitalism. The machines are gone, the workers are gone, the dream is gone. All that remains is silence. And if you listen close enough, that silence is screaming a warning to every business leader alive. Adapt or die. Innovate or disappear. The market doesn't care about your legacy. It only cares about what you are building today. Schwinn forgot that fundamental truth, and now the factory where they made their final desperate stand sits dark and abandoned, a tombstone for an empire that refused to change. Welcome to the silent Schwinn factory, where America's bicycle dream was born, dominated, and destroyed. Walk into a Walmart today, and you will see the name Schwinn sandwiched between lawn chairs and discount electronics. These aren't the machines Ignaz built. Industry insiders call them bicycle-shaped objects, mass-produced in China, assembled by stock boys, and owned by a Dutch conglomerate called Pawn Holdings. They still sell the nostalgia, re-releasing the Stingray to fathers who want to buy their childhood for their sons. But the final, physical link to the original dynasty was severed in June 2023. Richard Schwinn, the last family member making bikes in America, quietly closed the doors of his Waterford factory in Wisconsin. The streak is over. The empire is gone. All that remains is a sticker on a box. So, can the Dutch giant Pawn Holdings restore Schwinn to its former glory? The brutal truth is, they don't want to. In Pawn's massive portfolio, brands like Cannondale and Cervelo are the new kings of performance. Schwinn has been assigned a different role, the entry-level gatekeeper. Its job is to be the friendly, affordable face in Walmart that introduces you to cycling, hoping that one day you'll graduate to a $5,000 Cannondale. The glory of Schwinn was built on American steel and obsessive engineering. That era didn't just end with a bankruptcy, it was buried when the Waterford factory closed in 2023. What remains is a zombie brand, profitable, recognizable, but fundamentally hollow. The sticker on the tube says Schwinn, but the soul left the building 30 years ago.